I'm always amazed at the power of Palm Sunday to move me and to cause me to open up and look at the world in a new way. And certainly our Jesus puppet is gifted at helping us do that. About 10 minutes ago, when we were walking around the block, the people from First Presbyterian Church were outside having coffee. And as the Jesus puppet and the donkey went by, everybody kind of stopped and took a look. And as we continued down the block, I happened to see on one side of me some people I hadn't met before. So I greeted them and told them I was so glad they were with us on this Sunday. And they said to me, "Oh, well, we're not a part of your congregation. We're from First Presbyterian Church, but we love a parade." That's a nice way for our churches to get together, I think. Well, we've been marching that Jesus puppet around our block for at least a decade, and every year I'm stunned by the power of the face of that puppet. There's something about that face, it seems to hold both a haunting sense of sadness and an almost human longing that I find hard to believe a puppet can portray. But somehow I believe that we receive the majesty and the pathos of this Palm Sunday, this day, through the drama we see from the word-made paper mache. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan report in their book called The Last Week that there were two parades that began that first Palm Sunday long ago. On one end of the city, a parade began, much like the ones that we are familiar with these days. As Pontius Pilate, the Roman Empire's field marshal, entered the city, he came in with all the muscle and might of a conqueror, called in to keep the peace. He rode in on a war horse with marching troops, a military band, national flags waving, and strong weapons. It was all about keeping the peace by the use of power, intimidation, and force. It was the kind of display of muscle we are used to, one that tells us who's in charge and that order will be maintained at all costs. That's the parade on one side of the city. On the other side comes in a young man riding a donkey. He makes his way through a rickety gate, and it's actually called in Jerusalem the Donkey Gate. That gate is reserved for animals to pass into the city. He's surrounded by a ragtag bunch of followers who don't have much, only palm branches they've pulled from trees along the way, and their old coats, which is in the passion of the moment they tear off and throw on the ground. The peace that is being kept here is a different kind of peace. The peace that is being proclaimed here is a peace that passes our common understanding, a peace that looks foolish to outsiders, even silly. A single person riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, proclaiming a different kind of authority, one that has the courage in his convictions to create a different kind of scene, quietly challenging the powers that be. Where would you be if you were there on that day? Standing on the streets of Jerusalem at attention? Would you be at home with the shutters drawn, trembling in a corner? Or would you be out there on the dirt path, pulling branches from the trees and laying your coat down on the ground? I know where I would want to be. I'd want to be out there in the brilliant sunlight, quickened by the thrill of a tiny parade and the excitement that seems to be gathering around Jesus. Jesus knew that all creation longs to participate in the drama of salvation, that the deepest human desires were being acted out on that day. Jesus knew that the world then and now longs for real peace to exist without the threat of violence, that the world longs for humility and mercy to outstrip the powers of brute force, and that the world longs for liberation of our captive hearts so that all might be free at last. The contrast between the two parades is stark. It holds no ambiguity. The choice is clear. The gospel makes it plain that even the stones would cry out if they could. The simple act of riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey begins Holy Week. It is the most demanding and powerful week of the Christian year. This first day of the week completes our journey of Lent, and this first day of the week invites us now to follow Jesus into the city and to move through this week all the way to the cross. Palm Sunday has a way of breaking us open to the events of the coming week, to the thoughts of a Last Supper together, an agonizing prayer in the garden, arrest, betrayal, a military trial, and sentencing to death on a cross. Our basic instinct is to skip it all. Skip it. Come to church next week for all the fun and the fanfare and the cookies and the pictures by the bell and the hallelujahs. Come to the resurrection. But as one of my pastors reminded me years ago, Reuben Shears, there is no Easter without going through Good Friday, no new beginnings without some endings, no resurrection without death. And sadly, it is for many a Good Friday world, and to skip through this part of our human story is to ignore the state of the world and our ultimate dependence on the God of justice, mercy, and compassion. Today, this very day, is the 33rd anniversary of the death of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador. As a priest, Romero witnessed numerous violations of human rights in his country and began to speak out on behalf of the poor and the victims of his country's civil war. Over time, his conscience led him to a non-violent form of liberation theology, which aligned him with Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. As the war heated up in El Salvador, Romero became the voice of the voiceless. Every speech he made, every sermon he preached, every communion mass he presided over was broadcast throughout the streets of the city. Folks would move around San Salvador from street to street, never missing a word. Every radio in every house on every street was tuned in to Romero. He became the voice of the city, the hope of the voiceless. On March 24th, 1980, Romero presided over the Mass in a tiny chapel in a corner of the city. One day before, he had preached a sermon in which he called upon the soldiers as Christians to obey God's higher order, a higher order than the ones they were following, and stop carrying out the government's repression and violation of human rights on the people of his country. As Romero led the Mass, he was in the act of raising the chalice for a blessing. And at that moment, he was shot several times and died immediately at the scene. It is believed that the assassins were members of Salvadorian death squads, including 2 graduates of the School of the Americas. And it is said, it may be folklore, but the altar was spilled with blood and some of it fell into the chalice. Days before his death, Romero said, "I do not believe in death without resurrection. If they kill me, I will rise again in the people of El Salvador." It is appropriate for us on this edge of Holy Week to reflect on the terrible history of world events that have broken open so many lives and destroyed the cause of justice and peace in our world. from international drone strikes to neighborhood gun violence, from overcrowded prisons and overstuffed refugee camps to the homeless shelters around this city. We must be united in our desire to find common ground and to practice non-violent love as it is given to us through Jesus, peace, reconciliation, and to recognize in each person and each creation of God, God's humanity in each one of our brothers and sisters, so that all might realize basic human rights and be touched by the embrace of the compassionate God of justice and love. It is the beginning of that week. Which parade will we join? To be a follower of Jesus is to walk down that long road through the city and up the stony path to Calvary. To be a follower of Jesus is not easy or simple or pain-free, but it is the way of compassion and mercy. And so we stumble forth, relying on God's grace and with faith and trust that the God who is for us is also with us and goes ahead of us, clearing the path, preparing the way, leading us onward. Amen.